One side more or less announcing that the army should intervene and fast, the other side threatening the leader, or rather the spokesman for the opposition, José Calvo Sotelo, with murder. If the three of us were to spontaneously decide to just go for beers in a local pub, I'm sure we would put more careful organization into that enterprise than into that assassination. It was completely slapdash.
What wins this war almost every time is the pulverization. There's a lot of signals here for the Second World War. In some of the pictures, a kind of joke figure, but he's not.
No.
He's a coldly ruthless killer.
Imagine a dozen garrison commanders like that rather than just one. I'm pretty sure that's what you would have had without the assassination of Calvo Sotelo.
If we do have a full-on sort of socialist government, let's say, in Spain, what does their role then become in the Second World War?
A tethered goat.
It's the middle of the 1930s, and the temperature in Spain is reaching boiling point. Yet the heat's not coming from the glare of the Mediterranean sun, but a political battle between the left wing and the right wing. And by July 1936, this erupts in a violent and bloody, near 3-year-long civil war. In some ways, it was a dress rehearsal for the Second World War. Allied with Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy, the Nationalists were victorious. And while the Republicans had the support of the Soviet Union, Western powers stayed well away. Hitler's ally Franco would install a fascist dictatorship and lead Spain right up until his death in 1975. So where might we be had the Republicans emerged victorious? I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode, we focus on a different military campaign or a tide of history, and with the help of our experts, we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today is the Spanish Civil War, a brutal and deeply ideological conflict that set the tone for the Second World War and beyond. So what might a Republican victory have meant for Hitler's ambitions, Barbarossa, and Cold War Europe? These are, of course, questions for our experts, and joining me today, as ever, the historian and author Rear Admiral Dr. Parry, and returning to the channel once again is the senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy, Dr. Klaus Schmider. Welcome to you both, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to have you back in the studio. Now, I should just say before we begin, we have actually done an episode on Hitler's Mediterranean plan, which we might cover a few topics we also do in this episode. So if you haven't watched that, I would suggest watching this episode first to lead into that. Now, we have in front of us a map from July 1936. In the blue, these are the Republican-held areas. You could actually at this point say these are the more government-held areas, and in pink you have the rebels. As I say, this is July 1936, but this is actually a conflict which has its roots far beyond that, Chris. You could even say that this story begins in the 19th century.
Yes, it does, and I think it begins really with the reign of Queen Isabel. She has to leave and they form a republic in the 1870s. But they can't quite kick the monarchist habit, so they bring back not only her son, Alfonso XII, but also her grandson, Alfonso XIII. And he survives in power until about 1931. But intermixed in all of this, you've got huge economic pressures, you've got social tension, you have military coups, one in 1923, and Spain can't really make up its mind about its form of government. Then you have the Russian Revolution, you have Marxism injected into this, you have Trotskyism, and you've got very, very powerful workers, I wouldn't call them unions, associations that are essentially inspired by Trotsky and inspired by Lenin, particularly in the north, in Asturias, that's this blue area here, which was where most of the industry, the coal mining and other assets are and things like that. The urban poor are not very happy. And in the rural areas, you've got big landowners, huge assets. Yeah. They're called latifundia. They're big farms and ranches, if you like. And the peasants don't have many rights, and they don't have much spare income either. Add to that, throughout this period, you've got fluctuating economic outcomes, particularly for the Iberian Peninsula. And you get a series of governments which are very unstable, including one dictatorship under a chap called Miguel Primo de Rivera.
And that comes after 1923?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, in 1923. They all have a go at this. The monarchy's in the background. All sorts of regimes are tried. There's combinations. And it culminates really in a sort of right-wing government between 1932 and 1935. And all sorts of reforms are promised, never delivered.
Yeah.
And these tensions that have been going on for 2 generations effectively bubble to the surface all at once, all over Spain. And what we have to understand is that Spain historically was divided into Castile and Aragon. Mm-hmm. And there are 2 separate movements. Aragon is partly Catalonia, and also the Basque Country to the north. Now, they're separatists, so they're quite keen to have independence again.
Still are, arguably.
Yeah, that persists even today, as you say. So you've got these separatist movements as well. Now, what's quite defining is in 1934, you have a major revolt up in the Asturias of the workers here who believe their rights aren't being sort of respected, they're not getting enough money, their families are in poverty. And that is put down by a general called Franco with real brutality. Now, Franco is a general who has been very successful as a brigadier by the age of 33 in the Army of Africa. Because what we have to remember is Spain has Spanish Morocco here.
And it will become very important as we progress the story.
Indeed, to this day, they have Melilla and Ceuta, as you well know. And he has a group of officers whom he associates with called the Africanistas. Mm-hmm. And these are the real hard end of the Spanish army. And what happens in 1936, in February, a popular front, so-called, government is actually elected. And they see the threat from the army, particularly from Franco. And what they do is they banish the top generals to governorships. Yeah. So Franco is sent to the Canary Islands, another one is sent to the Balearics, and another one is sent to Pamplona. And so they start plotting a coup. And that's the key point that we have to remember at this point. All the while, you've got political violence going on in most of the cities here, all the Trotskyite separatist elements, including also the right wing called the Phalange, and various other groups, Carlists, monarchists, all sorts of things. You've got this mosaic of different sort of parties all fighting each other on the streets. So you've got this febrile atmosphere, you've got an army coup in the background, and on top of that, people are being assassinated. Yeah.
And just before I move the story on, Klaus, that atmosphere that Chris talks about, we mentioned the reforms earlier. One thing I wanted to ask you, I don't want to extrapolate too much, it's a different sort of thing, but if you think about something in the UK like the Industrial Revolution, happened over a period of 100, 150 years, all of this turmoil and these reforms, this is kind of happening in a more concentrated period of time.
In a more concentrated period of time, and crucially also mostly focused on chunk of Catalonia and here the Basque country. Mm-hmm. So it's not like the rest of Spain actually benefits a great deal from this. And even the riches that come from these local success stories come with actually second and third order effects that are disruptive to society. You have major riots in Barcelona in 1917, and this is at a time where Catalan industrialists are making money hand over fist, making shells for the French army. Mm. So it's almost like the Spain of the period, you could say, just struggles to find the right mixture, industrial or rural. Each of them is going to come with its own set of problems. And it's not, and somebody has yet to, you could say, step forward and produce, you could say, a philosopher's stone that might, you could say, get them out of this particular conundrum.
And that political turmoil that we see throughout the 1930s, where the war begins in 1936, you often in history get these kind of tinderbox moments. Mm-hmm. If you look at the First World War, people always argue it's the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Mm-hmm. In this case, it's a tale of 2 assassinations in July 1936.
I think before we go into the triggers, I think it's really worth mentioning the overlay of ideology here. So you've got an impulse towards democratic government. So you've got elections. They go through the formality of elections every now and then, but they're punctuated by coups. That's the problem, and various pressure groups. We mustn't underestimate the fact that at this point, of course, the ideology of fascism is coming from Italy and Nazi Germany very strongly indeed, along with, obviously, Stalinism coming from the Soviet Union. And we're well past socialism in one country, in Russia. We are now into the socialist international. So you've got all sorts of ideologies infusing this. If you look at the literature at the time, there's an explosion of political literature in Spain. Far greater than before. And
this is a story of ideology, as I started with. You are seeing all of that taking place within Spain.
Yeah, you could say that. And don't get me wrong, you've had extremists in parliament, you could say, in societies run by parliament since the dawn of time. This need not be, you could say, more than a marginally destabilizing element. You just need a couple or maybe three major parties as an anchor in the center. But the two biggest parties in 1930 Spain, the conservative CEDA and the socialist PSOE, well, without going into the ins and outs, let's just say that a number of their spokesmen on a few occasions have made it clear that their allegiance to the idea of power sharing, coalition government, and regular elections is at best conditional. And these are the moderates.
Yeah.
So you get an idea of what you're dealing with here. Yeah. And then, as you already hinted at, in June, July 1936, you get to a culmination point. There are two debates in Parliament were quite literally, I was going to say veiled threats, no, quite open threats are uttered by deputies. One side more or less announcing that the army should intervene and fast, the other side threatening the leader, or rather the spokesman for the opposition, José Calvo Sotelo, with murder.
Yeah.
I mean, that is like, imagine that. That's become par for the course in June, July 1936 in Spain. Yeah. In the meantime, in the background, the clock on the coup has been ticking away. What happens then on July 12th, a lieutenant of one of the paramilitary police bodies, the Guardia de Asalto, gets himself murdered. Now, he was well known as somebody who was on the side of the left.
José
Castillo, correct. And he was only a lieutenant, but shall we say, he was moonlighting as an instructor for the armed militia of the PSOE. So that marked him out. Yeah. You could say that he was a marked man. And then several of his comrades decided to, well, first of all, exact retribution, and secondly, take it up a few notches, like half a dozen. Let's take out the leader of the opposition. And José Calvo Sotelo, just so we're clear on this, strictly speaking, shouldn't be leader of the opposition. He heads a relatively small party, Renovación Española, but he's highly articulate and very, very charismatic. So when he speaks, everybody listens, irrespective of whether you love him or loathe him. Okay, he gets attention.
You can think about personalities today.
Indeed, yeah.
You call him an influencer. Yeah. And in the small hours of July 13th, a group, 9, 10, a mixed group, which is really the most astonishing part of Guardias de Asalto, which are, of course, the comrades of Teniente Castillo, led by a civil guard officer and a few civilians who just came along for the ride, knock on his door, threaten to knock it down, say that they're here to serve an arrest warrant. After a bit of toing and froing, they insist that he can't phone anybody. He insists that he has diplomatic immunity, which is true enough. In the end, he consents to allow himself to be driven away, and literally just minutes down the road, he's shot in the back of the head and murdered.
The ironic thing is, they went for somebody else first.
Oh, yes.
Because they couldn't find him. They went for Calvo Sotelo. That's the interesting thing about it, how these triggers are. It's like, as you say, with the Archduke Ferdinand, the guy actually missed the target initially.
It's a bit like, imagine for a moment if the three of us, after recording this show, were to spontaneously decide to just go for beers in a local pub. I'm sure we would put more careful organization into that enterprise than into that assassination. It was completely slapdash.
Yes.
There's even the very real possibility that there wasn't a genuine consensus among the members of the hit team whether he was to be kidnapped, murdered, or something else.
Well, slapdash, if we stay with that thought, because that, as we just said, puts the wheels in motion for the Civil War. But the ironic thing is that this sort of first begins now with a coup that is semi-failed.
Yeah, absolutely. This triggers a series of sort of confrontations in quite a lot of cities and towns throughout Spain. And it's quite clear the government initially has got a grip on it, to tell you the truth. But then you have a situation where Franco is flown back to Spain, and the Army of Africa, which is very loyal to him. He's been chief of the General Staff,
we'd
of
mention
course.
It, yes.
He's been chief of the army, and the Army of Africa is poised to actually intervene. And this is both Spanish troops, very hardened, in two Rif wars, as they're called, in recent memory, and also colonial troops. So that in Spain, of course, is a real issue, to have colonial troops actually on the mainland itself. And the critical thing that gets the war going in earnest is the fact that the Army of Africa is allowed to get across the strait. Now, the government controls the straits. It's got its navy in place. It's in Cartagena. It's in Ferrol.
Yeah, crucially, the navy have not joined the coup.
No, they haven't.
And there's a blockade in place.
The officers tried to, and were in most cases found out and generally murdered by their own men.
Rather like the Russian Revolution in that sense. And so, the workers are, if you like, in the ascendant. It's ironic, really, because Ferrol is where Franco comes from originally. But anyway, the Army of Africa is mobilised, and critically, they are flown to Spain by Italian and German military aircraft, Junkers 52 and Savoia Marchetti planes.
Yeah.
And the ability to airlift them across the strait to avoid the maritime blockade by the government is absolutely critical to this coup succeeding, and also the war then continuing. Because what that enables Franco and his fellow generals to do is actually occupy the south and east of Spain and thrust out toward Badajoz and out to the north as well. And it gives them a base in which to operate.
And we'll move over to the other map at some point in this conversation. You'll just see the territory change. But we'll come back to it. That is the crucial moment. And, of course, the Western powers, as I said, have a non-intervention. They do not back
If I could just maybe backtrack for a few days. Franco famously is a Galician. Okay, Admiral Parry already pointed it out, he comes from this region. And Spaniards are fond of saying that meet a Galician on the stairs, and you'll never know whether he's going up or down. In short, Galicians like to keep their options open. And there is considerable circumstantial evidence that Franco himself, supposedly the Bond villain, the string puller, in his lair in the Canarias, was actually hesitating to throw his hat in the ring until he heard of the assassination of Calvo Sotelo. So now you have a key player on site, and who knows, he might have joined anyhow, but possibly after some hesitation. Now he's joining for sure.
Yeah.
And that is enormously important. I'm convinced the coup would have come about anyway, but it would have carried far less momentum.
Yeah. Is he officially even leader of the Nationalists, the rebels, until sort of that point.
He's been the chief of the army, and the other generals defer to him. So as soon as they're on the ground here, General Mola goes to the north to operate there. He takes this region here. I mean, later on, as we'll probably discuss, Franco gets very lucky because two of his rivals actually die in plane crashes, and a third actually shoots himself by accident on a firing range. So all the rivals clear themselves out of the way. But Franco asserts himself very early, and people underestimate actually how successful he'd been as an army commander and the loyalty with which the Army of Africa actually sort of afforded him. And at this stage, of course, the Italians and the Germans are fully on side with this because they don't want to see a left-wing government operating here. They want to see the spread of fascism if necessary. And remember, part of the rebel alliance is a fascist phalangist group. And that's quite important to remember that.
So let's just move forward slightly, because then Franco just starts pushing towards the capital, but Madrid does not fall. And crucially as well, this is the Soviets are now sending supplies to the Republicans.
Indeed, but he and Mola here in the north, they have a fair-sized chunk of territory on which to base their operations. I mean, just to give you one example, I mean, this is a very, very strange coup. Coups, by definition, are supposed to work like that, okay? This one is staggered, 3.5 days. And there is some indication that Emilio Mola gave his fellow plotters a degree of latitude. If you don't want to go on the 18th, go on the 19th. But the garrisons of 4 provincial capitals up here in the northwest, okay? It's La Coruña, Pontevedra, León, El Ferrol. They all rebel on the 20th of July. Talk about being a Johnny-come-lately. Now imagine, I mean, in the real timeline here, having the entire northwest meant that the rebels had this industrial heartland of the Republic boxed in and cut off. Imagine if all of this here had remained in Republican hands. We're talking about a major difference.
We absolutely,
They also capture some fairly substantial naval units here as well, heavy cruisers that they're able to use later against the government forces.
And this, as you said, this will become absolutely crucial when we talk about Guernica.
But also the fact that it's the heart of the industry, coal mining and industrial capacity. It is incredibly important. The other thing, it's quite interesting the way the rebels actually think about this. They go immediately for this region, but they also, as we'll see, look to cut the government forces off from the French border as well. Quite extraordinary. And immediately, of course, the diplomacy starts to say, we don't need any interference here from Britain and France or anybody else. What's really interesting is that Portugal, of course, is always forgotten in these circumstances. This is actually headed by a right-wing, as we would call it now, government under a chap called Salazar. And he's quite keen, obviously, not to have a left-wing government in place here with all the Trotskyite, communist and other elements. He doesn't want what he calls a red border here. So he's actually starting to help the rebels. And of course, with this long border here, it enables the rebels to establish themselves quite significantly all the way up here to the west of Madrid. And as Klaus says, up here in Galicia to pressure the north as well. So you can see how the whole west of the country falls very quickly. And the thrust to Madrid, which is obviously the prize initially, occur from the west. So attacks on the Guadalajara and the Jarama River. They're not very successful, and we end up with a 3-year siege here, effectively, around Madrid. So this is difficult territory, and the government forces hold out here. There's no question about that. So they have to think of a different strategy. And later on, what we see is a thrust towards the Asturias to take this country here. That works. Cut off the border with France, and then a real drive through Teruel, not successful initially, but into Aragon, which is the old kingdom, which really is Catalonia. And that's where the major operations take place.
So we're now in sort of 1937, 1938.
But we must remember that in the centre here, and if you read your Hemingway, For Whom the Bell Tolls, this is all taking place here. It's these two attacks on the Guadalajara and the Jarama rivers that fail spectacularly, and they're heavy casualties. There's no question about that. But we'll talk about the Aragon campaign later, because that includes the Battle of the Ebro, which was probably the last chance of the government Republican forces to be able to force the issue.
Yeah. I mentioned it a little earlier, Klaus. Can we talk about Guernica right now? Because obviously people, fans of art, will be familiar, obviously, with Picasso's famous painting.
We can. It's not terribly relevant to our story. I know. I'm sorry if this sounds harsh. I mean, there were a number of other aerial attacks around this time, both before and after, by both German and Italian planes. And Guernica, well, certainly relative to the size of the place, was pretty devastating. It was by no means the worst in terms of casualties inflicted. The worst air raids by far were those the Italians did against Barcelona in 1938.
Has it taken on that mythology specifically because of the
Picasso,
painting?
It's partly Picasso, but Picasso in turn took his cue from the fact that Guernica had, shall we say, a certain
totemic value.
Thank you. It had It had already acquired a certain totemic value. Why? Because a British journalist was actually shacked up in the village next door. And all of a sudden you've got like the equivalent of 1930s live coverage. He might just as easily have been somewhere near Durango, which was attacked just before, in which case today we would be looking at a Picasso painting called Durango.
I mean, it's worth mentioning at this stage, of course, you've got nearly 15,000 Germans of the Condor Legion. You've got substantial modern aviation supporting the rebel forces. You've also got some pretty capable Italian troops, 70,000 of them operating. So they're giving quite a boost to the other side. The other thing is all the latest material that the Germans and Italians are producing in their industries is being put into this campaign on the nationalist side. I think we can call it nationalist now rather than rebel. What's interesting is that the tanks that are provided by the Russians, the T-26s, are actually better than the Panzer Is and the Italian tanks that the nationalist side have got.
And then they do the new technology, right?
Yeah. I mean, the T-26s are really good in this. But the government forces are outnumbered quite significantly in terms of modern aircraft. But also in terms of artillery as well. And what wins this war almost every time is the pulverisation of essentially government troops and positions by artillery and aerial bombardment. And there's a lot of signals here for the Second World War. You know, the Poles didn't take any lessons from this, I'm afraid, to see what would have happened if you bring in the Luftwaffe in strength and things like that. I mean, the real problem for the government side is that they're not like a normal army. They're actually formed in almost self-sealing militias. So you have to go and negotiate if you want some troops from the Trotskyites, for example.
Yeah, those factions are still operating at a military level.
And, you know, in 1937, you actually have a pitched civil war in Barcelona called the Evil May Days, where they actually fight each other. But, you know, where you have commanders actually having to say, look, we really fancy an attack along this river today. And they say, oh, no, we're not up for that. We're not politically pure enough within the brigade yet. And then, of course, you have 40,000 international brigaders. They're all fairly sort of individualistic, as you might imagine. And the besetting problem throughout the war for the government/Republican side is they can never coalesce within what you and I would call core and divisional strength. And they can't bring their artillery and aviation to bear in sufficient weight to be able to deal with what they're opposing.
Well, I mentioned earlier the territory changes are quite stark. So let's just jump forward now and look at exactly how it changed over the final year or so of the war. OK, we have another map in front of us. Now, this is from February 1939. And as you can see from here, the only sort of Republican-held territory is around Madrid and to the east of Spain. But before we get to that, we're just going to go back to the end of 1938, Chris, to pick up sort of the last remaining campaigns of the war.
We've already mentioned the drive to the north, the Asturias campaign, and also the Aragon campaign. The Nationalists have still plugging away at Madrid here. The Republicans are holding on to it. You've had these two failed campaigns either side. And what's happened here is that you've had a Republican campaign along the River Ebro here to try and break the campaign in Aragon. It's been absolutely catastrophic for them. And it was broken, as we've indicated, by basically aerial attack and also heavy artillery. And although initially successful, it caused huge numbers of casualties amongst the Republicans, and they never recovered from that. And at this stage, they start putting out feelers towards Franco. And Franco says, no, we're going for unconditional surrender. And right through to the end of the war, he says, I am not, under any circumstances, allowing anybody to surrender on terms. It's unconditional. Yeah. That's an interesting throw forward, of course, to the Second World War, which is exactly what the Allies said to Germany. And the bottom line is that the blockade has continued. The German and Italian warships and submarines have kept a lot of supplies away by this stage. You're starting to have starvation in these areas. Barcelona falls in February of 1939. And of course, then it's a drive down to Valencia, Alicante. Yeah. And I'm afraid it's all over after that.
And the Battle of Ebro, to both of you, that was the last hope for the Republicans, but really, I mean...
misguided hope.
Exactly.
In the sense that the Battle of the Ardennes of December 1944 was the last hope for the Third Reich. In both cases, what you do is that you burn through your last reserves, and once you're done, the only thing you've achieved is holding on to a bulge, and ultimately you accelerate your own defeat.
And you have no negotiating position by saying, look, I still have an army in being. You don't want to deal with that, do you? And that's the implication. And of course, as we said, it's unconditional surrender. Madrid eventually falls, and it's essentially Franco then gets on a horse, rides in and says it's all over. You have huge numbers of people killed in the wake of the Civil War. Grievances are settled, political rivals are eliminated. And of course, a lot of property changes hands as a result.
Yeah, as Chris says, unconditional surrender in this, Madrid is sort of still blue, but by March it is all over. And
well, you could say that civil wars more often than not do end in unconditional surrenders. But if you were to make a comparison with, shall we say, the American Civil War, 70 years previously, there you do not get a vindictive bloodbath that lasts for like 5 years, which is what you get here.
Yeah. But you did in the Russian Revolution, of course, in the Civil War. Yeah.
Well, that was even worse.
so, you know, I mean, the 20th century civil wars tend to be quite bloody afterwards, and I'm afraid this occurs just afterwards.
Yeah, that vindictive bloodbath that Klaus talks about, the numbers are quite stark. I think it's 30,000 executed kind of almost straight away.
That's probably on the low side.
Yeah.
And 500,000 people immediately flee to France.
Yeah.
You know, so it's a huge displacement of personnel. And as I said, the scores keep on being settled almost extrajudicially afterwards as well. I think what's worth bearing in mind here is what's happening internationally while this is happening. So between 36 and 39, of course, you've got the build-up to the Second World War happening elsewhere. You've got the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Germans, and you've also got the build-up to the Polish campaign, of course, later in the year, once the Germans and the Italians are clear of what's going on here.
If we go to the non-intervention, as you talk about that, obviously, famously, Britain and France did not intervene in this. Was there any discussions within the government of thinking that perhaps they should?
Yeah, there was a discussion, but there was an international agreement between all the countries that previously belonged to the League of Nations that said, look, we're not going to intervene. The Germans, the Italians, the Soviets promptly ignored it. And the British and the French said, well, we're holding to that. And they tried to enforce it, not to any degree of success. But there was another issue as well. They weren't keen on the Soviets supplying the government forces. So there was an issue associated with, do we really want to be on the same side as the Soviets supplying these? I don't think so. What's really interesting is the British intelligence operation in Portugal. Remember, Portugal is...
Britain and Portugal are long
back
allies.
to the 14th century, absolutely. And the intelligence operation here is quite significant. And so that has, I think, consequences when we deal with the undone bit, had the Republicans won, for example.
And just before we deal with the undone bit, one more from me, Klaus. After all of the turmoil we saw in the 1930s, but I think probably remarkable is the wrong word to use, but obviously after this, Franco ends up leading all the way until 1975.
Yeah.
Until he dies.
Yeah, exactly. He dies in bed. So by that yardstick, he was a successful dictator, but needless to say, he left behind a more prosperous, but also divided and traumatized society, even after nearly 40 years.
And they're still finding the mass graves today.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the key thing. And, I think he's obviously a very contentious figure, Franco. There's no question he's decisive in his role here. It's difficult to define how decisive that was, but militarily, he conducts a campaign of attrition. He uses the logistics at his disposal, and in the end, he's successful. I can't get into the mind of Franco. We have this image of a chap with a moustache. He's quite small, 5'4", and he comes across in some of the pictures a kind of joke figure, but he's not.
No.
He's a coldly ruthless killer. But at the same time, he comes across as a Spanish grandee and Christian gentleman. He's an odd sort of character in that sense. And I think we in Britain, in particular, have difficulty in getting to grips with this man who has actually conducted a 3-year campaign of ruthless efficiency, in fact, and has managed to eliminate his rivals from very early on.
Complicated, certainly. That is the real history of what happened during the Spanish Civil War. Now let's undo all of that, because this, of course, is History Undone. OK, time to get into what we love doing here in History Undone and ask ourselves some really long-term questions. Had the Spanish Civil War not been won by the Nationalists? Now, we have in front of us our favourite Europe map of 1940 because the impact on the Second World War is kind of so stark from this conflict. Let's start where we often do with this segment, Chris. Could they have won? And if so, when? And we'll open this up.
Yeah, I think Klaus and I agree on this, that had the coup been sort of strangled early on, before the Army of Africa had arrived, you'd have ended up, I think, in a situation where you've had previous coups being attempted. It all settles down again into a fairly high roar, and the factional fighting continues. That's not to say another one wouldn't have happened down track, and they might have been better organised at that point. So I think that's the first time. I think you agree with that, Klaus, don't you? Because everybody gets encouraged by the fact the Army of Africa is transported across. So basically the actions of Hitler and Mussolini here are absolutely critical to making that happen. I think if you'd had possibly less political and military disunity amongst the Republican forces, if they'd had access to the same scale and sort of weapons and resources that the nationalist side ended up with, you might have actually had a more even contest. I think we've got a situation on the ground where the momentum was, and the initiative was always with the rebels and the nationalists. That's the key point. And apart from the battle on the River Ebro, you don't see major offensives by the government forces. They're always on the defensive, of course, which leaves you open to the sort of attacks that artillery and aviation bring. So I think unless they'd snuffed it out straight away, there aren't many opportunities later for this steamroller to be stopped.
Yeah, those first few days, 1936, that is...
I would say so, yes. And to me, what is absolutely key is to take a closer look at the garrisons that only proclaimed their allegiance to the insurrection as late as July 20th. That's a dead giveaway. Somebody's looking over their shoulder. Yeah. Somebody is anxious. Somebody is hedging their bets. And this is at a time, remember, where the death of the leader of the opposition actually appears at first glance to confirm the narrative of the right that we are already in a civil war situation, they're out to get us. This is going to be an Iberian version of Petrograd 1917. Now imagine for a moment that Calvo Sotelo had not been murdered on that particular night.
Question.
Then frankly, I can see far more garrison commanders wavering, and among the waverers, a far greater number would never have committed to anything. I mean, take the case, for instance, of the colonel who was in charge here in Santander in the north. He's a curious, but by no means unique case. There was a similar scenario in Valencia. He got orders from the rebels to join them. And he occupied a number of key facilities in Santander, but apart from that, really didn't do much of anything. Then the government of the Republic got on the phone, gave him instructions to do X. He didn't do that either. Yeah. So he just sat on his hands for 8 days until somebody, in this case, a government force, finally appeared in his driveway and said, okay, fun's over, you're out of a job. Imagine a dozen garrison commanders like that rather than just one. I'm pretty sure that's what you would have had without the assassination of Calvo Sotelo.
Do you agree with that?
I think it's one line. I think the minute you introduce the Army of Africa, it turns the tide. Okay. I mean, I think people are underestimating what people felt about that. If we're being silly about it, it's rather like bringing the British Army on the Rhine back to the UK for a coup in the 1970s or 80s. Yeah. That's the effect on the Spanish population if you look at the newspapers of the time. At this point, they almost go from being rebels into being nationalists, and people supporting the church, supporting traditional ways of doing things and things like that. To me, that's the thing. I mean, the Calvo Sotelo thing, I just wonder if it had been somebody else down track who'd been assassinated, would have then triggered it.
The thing with Calvo Sotelo is not just the fact that the leader of the opposition, or you could say the most charismatic spokesman for the opposition is murdered. It's the fact that, A, he was murdered by a mixed hit team of law enforcement agencies.
Agents of the government.
And that the government then tried to cover it up by muzzling the press, and then they botched the job and the news got out anyway. Yeah. I mean, talk about worst case scenario. I mean, it doesn't get any better than this. This is like the perfect storm. So I'm not quite sure whether any other, you could say, similar assassinations in maybe a slightly different context months later would have had quite the same impact.
I mean, it was heading that way. I mean, at the end of the day, the generals were planning a coup anyway, and it involved the Army of Africa. So my sense is...
The thing is, to get the vanguard of the Army of Africa across the strait, you need those German and Italian airliners. For that, you need German and Italian buy-in. Correct. And if the Mussolini and Hitler, shall we say, a week into the coup realize, oh my God, these guys are only holding on to scraps of the country, they're probably not going to commit.
Correct. Yeah. But I mean, the lesson here for anybody facing a coup is you deal with it decisively and early. You don't let it develop. That's entirely the point. Just think of recent coups in Turkey, for example, attempted coups. They were dealt with ruthlessly and early, politically and militarily. It wasn't dealt with here. And that's a function of, I think, the very diverse and disparate nature of politics and also society in Spain at the time.
OK, so let's go with the thread that it is dealt with early. It does fail. We've already sort of touched on it a little bit. It's kind of a fragile coalition. How long does that hold, and do you get another coup? If so, I mean, how soon after?
I would say that even with only a sort of coup that fails to generate momentum, a proper critical mass, you still have enough officers breaking cover to make sure there would be a blood purge afterwards. There was considerable controversy back in 1932 when the leader of the coup that took place in that year, which was a bit of a joke, General Sanjurjo, was not stood up against the wall and shot. Yeah, and it was seen as a very controversial decision.
Not the victim of a plane crash, by the way.
That's the later day plane crash victim. It's true. I dare say by 1936, tempers ran high. Okay, it's the Spain of 1936 is a Spain that is different from the Spain of 4 years previously. I seriously doubt that this time around, the leaders of a botched coup would have been treated with the same leniency as Sanjurjo was in 1932. there would have been a bloody assizes.
And Franco killed?
No, but I'm not even sure Franco would have committed. We have no proof of this.
So how important is his personality as well? If that coup fails, without someone like him leading the next one, I mean, is that important, or do we put too much weight on it?
But in this particular counterfactual, I would say that the Republican government, having defeated this coup with Mr. Franco just about still sitting on the sidelines, they would have accumulated enough political capital to say, listen, thank you for your service, here's a pension, there's the door. Which is not something they would have dared to do pre-July 36 after seeing off a coup of the kind we just, you could say, outlined. They would have had enough political capital to say, we're just making sure this time around.
I think if the bloodletting, had started, and it did start pretty early, I think there would be more retributive justice, in inverted commas. I think you'll end up in a situation where the government does lurch to the left. That's the most important thing. And you're going to start excluding those elements that can actually provide the tinder for any future coup, politically and militarily. So you're going to see political and military coups here. And I think the undone elements are what happens if you do end up with this very strange amalgam of left-wing groups, which include communists, Trotskyites, and, of course, the Soviet Union will be saying, well, our pattern in other countries is we support the communist element quite strongly. And we know, as in Russia and other places, if you have that activist element, they tend to win. So what you could have is a civil war between the left-wing groups.
Yes.
That's one possibility. Or you have the communists saying, right, we're in charge now, we're taking over. And we've got the Soviets behind us.
You're not so sure, Klaus?
No, because the Communist Party in Spain at the time was tiny. They don't get me wrong. They balloon in size and influence through the events of the Civil War. But in mid-36, the Partido Comunista Español is tiny, tiny. And you could even say, if you wanted to be flippant about it, that with a socialist party that is as radical as the PSOE is, you don't need a communist party.
No.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. I mean, that immediately introduces problems for Portugal, of course, because right next door you've got this heavily socialist government. So Salazar's feeling a bit sort of windy about this. And what is Italy and Germany's attitude to this country now?
Well, if there's another coup even, there's no guarantee that after the failed first one that Italy and Germany would support that. So it might not lead to a full civil war, or...
Depends what else is going on at the time, doesn't it? So if it happens after the invasion of Poland, for example, the Germans might not be too interested. But remember, the Italians aren't in the war at this stage.
Yeah.
Neither is France. OK, so a second coup or a second civil war at that stage probably brings in the Italians. Because where do they have ambitions? North Africa.
Yeah.
So they've got an interest in that respect as well. But I think the fun thing is, what if it becomes a full-on sort of socialist government? Portugal obviously feels a bit unstable. Germany carries on with its agenda, so does Italy. Poland is invaded, France is invaded. Do you really want this behind you when you're thinking of going east? And what's your attitude in relation to Britain then?
In that scenario then, Klaus, if we do have a full-on sort of socialist government, let's say, in Spain, what does their role then become in the Second World War?
A tethered goat. No, seriously. A few weeks back, we did this program on Mediterranean access, Mediterranean options more generally. One of the reactions by the viewers struck me as very ingenious. I think it was Mr. Vetter. He made the point that, by October 1940, not just Europe, the world is shell-shocked by what has just happened. And you've got the Wehrmacht parked here.
Excuse me.
So why didn't it...
Parked there.
Parked there.
Oh, dear.
We mustn't include Wilmington on Sea.
You're quite right. It's only right and proper. And as he put it, the Germans, surely enough, that sort of regime with armed forces, which are like at pitch-perfect tuning, if the Spaniards start haggling, as in, "No, we're not quite sure about letting you cross the border." Surely one A. Hitler, Lance Corporal retired, could and should have just said, "Well, thank you very much. I'll forward your complaints to the relevant government department, and please make sure that all arrangements are in place for 3 Panzer Corps to cross the border next Tuesday." And he's absolutely right, our viewer was. And the question is, why didn't he?
Yeah.
And the thing is that he has got a bit of an Achilles heel. He is incredibly self-conscious about putting himself in positions where he could look like a total fool. And I would put to you that there is such a thing as etiquette among fascists.
Yeah, I would certainly so with Mussolini.
Keep in mind, it's not just the fact that the Germans have intervened in Spain.
Yeah.
Most of the time, they actually go through the motions of pretending that they're not really there. That they dress up in Spanish uniforms, the uniform of the Spanish Foreign Legion, and their aircraft come in the colors of the Spanish Air Force. And yeah, well, it's not like many people are fooled by that, but it's a sort of message which resonates.
Yeah. It's a bit difficult for the Kriegsmarine, especially when they get attacked by Republican aircraft.
Then in the late spring of 39, something very interesting happens, which is generally omitted from most history books. The Condor Legion are given a victory parade in Berlin. And they pull out all the stops. They make a proper show of it. From now on, you really can't ignore it, okay? Mr. Franco has now just been accepted into the club of fellow fascists. Can you imagine how British propaganda would have made hay of the fact that even being a fascist is not going to save you from being invaded by the Wehrmacht? However, if in our counterfactual you don't have a fascist dictator in Madrid, but a socialist government, I'm afraid it would have been a feeding frenzy.
Absolutely.
Well,
we say, full-on invasion of Spain?
I don't know. I think you could have ended up with a situation where you're so coerced anyway that you're going to have to do as you're told. I mean,
well, also, Hitler in that scenario also must be thinking, yes, they have a socialist government, but he knows there is right-wing and fascist ideology within the country. I mean, it's a slam dunk, isn't it?
I mean, it's incredible. I mean, we know what happened at Ande when they discussed it. I mean, Franco's terms were too much for Hitler at the time. He wanted food and other aid and things like that. He wanted military modernisation. He had all sorts of demands that Hitler wasn't prepared to accept. But there's no doubt that if you'd have had a military campaign in Spain, Gibraltar, and closing the Straits and bringing on the whole Mediterranean strategy is incredibly attractive. There's no question about it. I've never seen any discussions in the documents about this.
As to the military options?
Yeah, never.
Well, I was going to say 10 years ago, it was probably 20 years ago, just goes to show my age. An American colleague did some excellent research on this, Tomorrow the World, that's the title of his PhD. And he stresses that the agenda, such as it was more defensive. Okay, that the Germans wanted Spain, not because Spain seemed important, but because it gave them a crossing point into North Africa, which in turn gives them the possibility to dot the coast of Morocco with air and naval bases in order to bolt the back door against a possible Anglo-American reaction.
I mean, the interesting thing here is what does Britain do?
Does Britain, in this scenario, does Britain surely doesn't stand a chance in North Africa?
No. Basically, you've got a problem. If you shut the Mediterranean, it's all over for British operations in the Mediterranean. So you've got to actually draw your horns in. But what's more interesting is, I suspect that in these circumstances, Portugal's going to be quite important for you. Because if you haven't got the Mediterranean, your route down past Africa to the Middle East and India and beyond is going to be infested, as Klaus says, by bases here and things like that. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to seize the Azores and Madeira. And also, you might want to actually say to Portugal, you're in real trouble here, because Hitler's not just going to stop with Spain, he's going to take you as well. So you could have seen a British expedition to reinforce and support Portugal. This is smacks of Wellington and everything like that now. So Britain's got to look to the Atlantic here, because if it loses the Mediterranean, then, as you say, the campaign here is over. You might be able to dig in Egypt. There's no question about that. But you've got this huge supply chain, which needs 3 times the amount of merchant ships to actually service it, unless you go through the Mediterranean. And so the whole character of the war changes. Then you have to say, how does this affect Hitler's approach to Barbarossa?
Yeah.
So if you're basically... So I think the other thing worth remembering here is that the Germans don't seek to hold the whole of France. Remember, Vichy France is held here. So does Spain become a sort of Vichy protectorate at this stage?
No, Klaus?
No, don't think so.
With access? I don't know.
And we are talking about Barbarossa, you mentioned it there. I'm conscious we're running out of time. Barbarossa still is going ahead?
It's still going ahead.
Yeah.
If anything, you've just been given a major incentive, because in terms of grand strategy, a glance at the map of Europe will tell you, well, you're now safe, as in properly safe, along your western flank.
The back door's shut.
The back door has just been nailed shut, so you can turn around and invade the Soviet Union.
I mean, the other thing is, if the Americans come into the war later, where's Germany first in this?
Yeah.
And where are you actually going to land? Because actually, if the Germans are dominating this whole seaboard now, all down here, where on earth are you going to land? The answer is probably West Africa.
My guess is the torch would still have happened. Don't get me wrong, there would have been a much tougher battle for it from the beginning, which is in itself an interesting what if, because let's face it, most of the troops invading Morocco and Algeria were green, especially the American ones, and crucially there would have been no bridgeheads in Algeria. So you're looking at you're looking at Operation Torch, in my opinion, still happening, but in a different form, and frankly would have been more of a challenge.
But here's the other thing.
Yeah,
I think you're looking at a nuclear option against Germany in these circumstances.
yeah, but not in November 1942.
No. But later on, the Manhattan Project, obviously directed against Japan. The only way you're going to crack this, I think, is with a nuclear device.
What sort of... You've brought me on to my question about the timeline, because we're in a different sort of time scale here as well, aren't we? Is this all happening from 1940 onwards? I mean, if the coup doesn't work properly in 1936, are we sure Germany is invading Czechoslovakia and Poland in 1939?
Yeah.
Or still that...
Definitely.
We're still on the same sort of time scale?
Germany's agenda here doesn't change. There's no question about that. And the preparations, to stop a two-front war and also then to go for Barbarossa, I think that stays in place. But what does alter is the fact that we can actually probably do both. We can do the Mediterranean strategy and we can do Barbarossa. And let's see who gets here first. I mean, it's a fact of life.
Don't get me wrong. I personally think that the British can still break a lot of mischief over here in Egypt, because the supplies which they need here, they come the long way round Africa anyway. And granted, if you have German U-boat bases here, then you may have to do a bigger loop.
And air bases. That's why I think that's why the Azores and Madeira become very important, because you're going to have to route out before you come back in again.
You will have to route out, but I'm not sure that the Middle East theatre would have been compromised. I see, however, Malta being compromised. I think Malta would have withered on the vine, and at the very least, its offensive capability would have been reduced to something negligible.
And as Chris says, the Manhattan Project on Germany.
Well, the Manhattan Project was always meant for Germany.
Yeah,
I mean, Japan is a nice to have extra, but that literally takes us into August 1945. And I dare say by that point in time, you could still have had an Allied victory in North Africa, an invasion of Sicily, and later the invasion of Normandy.
But, of course, Lend-Lease to Russia, that old chestnut is not happening in the same way that it did. With all these resources behind him, do we think, again, that Barbarossa might have been successful? So that changes the geometry yet again. If this had been successful, there are all sorts of options that get opened up here. And I'm surprised. I've seen virtually nothing on the operational strategic aspects of the Germans saying, right, we need to get Franco on side, or if it had been a socialist republic, we need to deal with this.
Final thoughts from both of you then on that topic, because Spanish Civil War is undoubtedly one of the most important events in Spanish history. But as we've just discussed, I mean, you could argue it's one of the most important events in 20th century history. Why is it perhaps a lot of people don't really know that much about it? It's not something that is talked about openly as much as other parts of 20th century history.
I would say for looking at any war either side of World War II, it is one of the most discussed wars of the 20th century.
Look at Hemingway, Orwell. You know, you've got quite Laurie Lee. There's a lot of literature.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very high-profile war. This is not to say that these rivers of ink do not always translate into an understanding of military realities on the ground.
No. The other thing, Fergus, is of course with the Second World War coming on behind, the first one
blows everything out the water.
Tends to sort of be pushed to one side. But the fact of life is there is besetting interest in the Spanish Civil War. It has an exoticism about it that the Second World War lacks. I think the other thing is there's a romanticism about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's the issue. You've got the International Brigades, as I said, Hemingway, you've got Laurie Lee, George Orwell, all getting something out of it, which they project elsewhere. And yeah, I think that's the issue. But it's also an open and shut war. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end in the way that perhaps others don't.
Absolutely fascinating. Well, we are saying then, if the Republicans had perhaps managed to win the Spanish Civil War, you perhaps then get a socialist Spain. Adolf Hitler and Italy do not come in on the side of the rebellion in 1936. But then we fast forward to the Second World War. After taking France, does Adolf Hitler then push forward to Spain, take the whole of Spain, go for the Mediterranean option we've talked about in a previous episode, push through North Africa? What then happens to Barbarossa? Almost certainly we're saying Barbarossa still goes ahead. But then the crucial point, the Manhattan Project, is the bomb then dropped on Germany, not on Japan? I'm afraid that is all we've got time for today. My thanks to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry and Dr. Klaus Schmider for joining me. We'll be back undoing more history very soon. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. And you can also listen and follow the show as a podcast. Just search for History Undone in your podcast apps, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.